The Annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah and the Creation of the People of Anu, A History of Sumerian Origin. This is from October 2015 from a website called Enki Satya. Links are included below. I'm going to skip to the conclusion here. It's quite long, but if I read this whole thing, it's an hour. I'm going to make this short. I'm going to start with the conclusion and then hit some high points. Conclusions. The story of destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Hebrew Bible is a late recast of a group of more ancient Mesopotamian historical records, which includes the Babylonian Erra Epos and the Lamentations of Sumer. The original texts recount a fierce conflict among the gods and then bear witness to a great catastrophe that would bring about the sudden demise of the Sumerian civilization and force the Enkite gods to evacuate themselves from the earth. The devastating conflict recounted in the ancient text was in fact an ancient nuclear war, which broke out between two opposing factions of advanced extraterrestrials. The Anoistas would resort to atomic weapons of mass destruction in order to defeat the Enkites and make them retreat from the earth. The evil wind, an ancient reference to the radioactive fallout caused by the atomic bombs, would desolate the cities of our gods and weaken their dominion over the region of Mesopotamia. Immediately, the extraterrestrials of the faction of Anu would invade the earth and take over some areas of the planet. They would war ruthlessly with the Enkites and sow chaos in the Middle East. Anu would establish a bastion of his Anuist cult in the region of Palestine under the Semitic pseudonym El. Meanwhile, his powerful celestial henchmen, allied with the infamous Dracos, would crush the Enkite resistance and take many of our gods as prisoners. From there arises the idea of the rebellious angels enchained in the abyss of the underworld in the apocalyptic literature of the Judaism of the Second Temple period and the later New Testament. Fortunately, other gods of ours, Enki included, managed to escape in time and retreated from the earth, returning to their home in the constellation of Orion in order to prepare their future counterattack. The story of Abraham in Genesis is nothing more than a late pseudo-historical tale whose purpose has been the justification of the Jews as a chosen people of God. God, quote-unquote, with a small g. Abraham is a fictitious archetypal character, and the account of his election is an allegory which conceals a very sinister real event. In reality, Yahweh, Anu, didn't choose any Abraham. He created a new hybrid race in Palestine via genetic engineering on the basis of his own genetic material and that of the Dracos, so that they would be his chosen people. He entrusted to his people a special mission: the systematic destruction of all the Enkite Gentile civilizations and the domination of the world, Zionism. From this new Anuist race would appear the enigmatic Hyksos around 1800 BCE. That is Hyksos, if you want to look that up. And they would attempt to wreak ruin on the Enkite kingdom of Egypt. The Anuist pharaoh Akhenaton would come into the scene and try to control the ancestral Egyptian religion in order to replace it with the trash of Anu. Egypt would remain strong. Folks, I'm going to interject here. If you've seen some of my previous video on Akhenaten, he has the same story as Moses. He was found on the river. He was brought into the house of the pharaoh where he was raised and trained in the Egyptian religion. He didn't feel like he fit in. He left Cairo. He went out across the Nile and built his own city in the desert. He created monotheism, had his own priesthood, and was the only intermediary between his people and God. It's the story of Moses with some different details and a different name. Get back to the article. Later, at the beginning of the first millennium BCE, the same Anuist lineage would organize itself again and form the Hebrew people, the self-proclaimed chosen people, and the Hebrews would wage war with all neighboring polytheistic nations. In the 1st century CE, the elite of the people of Anu would devise the most intricate plot in history. They would create two more religions based on their monotheistic Judaism, two Jewish cults, very poisonous and self-destructive, in order to sell it to the Gentiles in Europe and the Middle East, and it would be the Jewish Trojan horse. Jewish Christianity would be established in Europe, and Jewish Islam would take over the minds of the Arab people. Then the Zionist Jews, the ultimate puppeteers, would infiltrate the Christianized foreign societies and in the end expand their dominion over the Gentile peoples. In ancient times, the same people would take over many of the governments of the world with the help of their evil god Anu, Yahweh, and establish their new world order. Now the followers of Anu are the most powerful, almost have a monopoly on the world's political power, and manage much of the wealth. Now the Anuist Zionists are enjoying the promise which their demonic god Anu Yahweh made to the archetypal Jewish father Abraham and to the prophets of the Bible. He is handing over to them power over all the nations and making them the masters of the whole world. In the end, the Judeo-Christian Bible is, in reality, a covert outline for millennial Zionism. Jewish Zionism is sponsored by Anu Yahweh, the enslaver of mankind and the cosmic enemy of Enki. Alright, that was the conclusion. Let's go back to some of these juicy parts up here and read some details. This article starts out talking about the nuclear bomb testing and weapons in 1945 in Alamogordo, New Mexico. The device explosions and the effects they had. It talks about the two bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Talks about the nations of the earth entered into a state of paranoia, and the whole world felt that the feared doomsday was drawing nearer. The threat of nuclear war had already become a reality. Then it goes into perhaps what I've just said will be a surprise for many readers, which was above. Even if human civilization were to be destroyed by atomic weapons in this century and not so distant date, it wouldn't be for the first time. The doomsday of the third millennium consisted in a terrifying atomic military showdown, which would devastate the kingdoms of Mesopotamia and the Middle East. Such event has been forgotten by modern historians, but it was documented in the historical records of the time. The most famous of them is the book of Genesis of the Hebrew Bible, in which the event appears as the well-known account of Sodom and Gomorrah. However, very few people know that in reality, the aforementioned biblical story is based on a much more ancient Mesopotamian history. The destruction of the cities by supernatural means was recorded in a Sumero-Akkadian text called the Erra Epos, and in a group of Sumerian registers known as the Lamentations of Sumer, more than a millennium before the composition of the Hebrew Bible. Similar to the biblical account, those Mesopotamian texts recount how a handful of cities in the Middle East was annihilated by the mysterious weapons of the gods, and many more places were desolated by the deadly pollution that they produced. The Hebrew account of Sodom and Gomorrah and the Mesopotamian paleo-apocalyptic texts on which the biblical event is based bear witness to a nuclear conflict between different factions of alien beings wherein weapons of mass destruction of an extraterrestrial origin were unleashed. At the end of the third millennium, this is 2100 BC, folks, the Enkite gods headed by Marduk found themselves in a face-off with the Anuist gods in a violent rivalry for supremacy in the region of Mesopotamia. Unable to break the deadlock in the struggle, the crazed Anuist gods decided to resort to atomic weapons for the advancement of their military campaign. Now, the nuclear war, according to the histories, you've got your Hebrew version, you've got your Anunnaki version. The weapon was called the Seven Terrific. The Seven Terrific were called the Unrivaled, the Burning Flame, that which crumbles with fear, the Mountain Melter, the Wind that finds the end of the earth, the Unforgiving above or below, and the Vaporizer of living, respectively. Those weapons of mass destruction would soon be unleashed against the cities of Marduk in the great ancient nuclear war of Mesopotamia, or the final doomsday. The Lamentations of Sumer, a group of very ancient record historical texts which recount the pitiful and heartbreaking desolation of the cities of the Mesopotamian lands around the year 2000 BC, describe the effects of the destruction in even more detail. First, Lamentations make it clear that the destruction was not only was not by any natural calamity, but rather a great storm decreed by Anu. Second, the text detailed that the great storm of Anu was a result of an enormous explosion described as a malefic blast that was the forerunner of a malignant storm. Third, the cruel punishment of that Anu decreed is described as a razing storm, R-A-Z-I-N-G, joined by a scorching heat. We see here that the storm of Anu doesn't refer to a meteorological tempest, but rather to a column of fire that scorches everything that it touches. Fourth, the same scary phenomenon not only burned the earth, but it deprived the earth of the shining sun of the day and made the stars of the night invisible. The smoke of the storm of the fire reached up to the sky and blocked out the solar light completely, something that wouldn't happen with a normal storm. Fifth, in the following days, an evil wind seized the inhabitants, made their faces turn pale, made them cough up blood, and polluted the water of the rivers, making it bitter and deadly. Sixth, the texts recount that after the razing of the cities, the agricultural fields and the prairies were contaminated and gave bad weeds and shriveled plants. All these descriptions are identical to the devastating effects of an atomic explosion. Certain areas of the Middle East were destroyed by atomic weapons of extraterrestrial origin in a brutal war between the gods of the faction of Marduk and the enemy gods of the clique of the evil Anu. Okay, the great storm in heaven. This is from Lamentations again. I'm thinking of an article I read. The elephants stumbled and the skin fell off their bones. Have you ever heard that? I don't find it in here. Let's see. It talks about the cities of Marduk. Dark smoke rose up into the air and the sky blackened. The following days, a nuclear winter would block out the solar light and the stars of the night would no longer be visible. I think it was Lot that described when his wife turned around and turned into a pillar of salt. He said that the smoke was like a cloud out of an oven, describing a mushroom cloud. Anyway, folks, it was a nuclear war. I'm going to leave the links to this very long article, but it's super interesting to read. It's talking about Abraham being a fictitious patriarch, that the Bible was created to justify the chosen peopleness of the Jews, the Hebrew race, and how all of it, Christianity being Judaism 2.0 and Islam being Judaism 2.1, talks about the fictitious Jewish archetypes of Abraham, of Moses, the cults of the Levantine regions, the Phoenicians, the Amorites, the Canaanites. Then it talks about the cult of El, who was also known as Yahweh, or Anu, would become Kronos, which is now Saturn, if you've been looking at the Saturn matrix. The first Proto-Hebrews born among the ancient Canaanite people, they would resemble their Levantine Semitic neighbors, but their DNA would be modified by the Anuists, and they would turn out very different from other races of mankind. Therefore, the Jews would turn out with many of the perverse traits of their creator. The Dracos, or the Saurians, mixed with the genetics of Anu. So they have hatred for the Gentile peoples or non-Jews, racial collectivism, cunningness, deception, superiority complex, persecutory delirium, amoralism, depravity, a victim complex, hypocrisy, materialism, greed, warmongering, bloodlust, and an insatiable thirst for domination. The article goes on to talk about how these people spread and infiltrated into all the religions and governments of the world and out throughout Europe and became the Catholics eventually and the Muslims, taken over the Vatican, and basically today it's led by the Pope and the Jesuits and the Club of Rome and the Illuminati within the Freemasons. But there are so many clubs and brotherhoods, but this is where it all comes from. Some people say Freemasonry is Kabbalistic Judaism for Gentiles, for initiated Gentiles. And then you have your churches, which follow those same things. But all of it, folks, the Bible, Christianity, Islam, and Judah, all of it. I don't think, even though they're talking about Anu against Enki, all of these were not God. They weren't God with a capital G that's up in heaven. These are all three-dimensional beings from a solar system or a star constellation in a cluster around near us who can appear to us in our dimension, on our plane, in our frequency. So they are either fallen angels or archons from a different planet or different levels within space around us. But I don't think at any time we're to assume that either side is actually God. Okay, these people lead the bizarre teachings would be pure poison for the Gentiles, total pacifism, undue altruism, blind obedience, obscurantism, abnegation of the ego, love for enemies and even for those who oppress us, the relinquishment of any type of ancestral spiritual knowledge, the strange humiliation of oneself as a lost sinner, an unhealthy preoccupation with guilt and shame, fatalistic dependence, and an irrational fear towards otherworldly concepts such as the devil, hell, and final judgment. Christianity would end up turning millions of Gentiles into docile and submissive slaves with no fighting and spirit, easy to dominate. Now I know, folks, I believe in Christ. I've had spiritual experiences. I've had demonic attacks, and I've had angelic experiences. So I know there is a God with a capital G. But this history here does describe how the gods with the small g have put us in the situation that we find today, which is our governmental and religious and banking system, and our health system, and our education, and our military. Okay. It goes on in this article to say that even Jesus Christ was a character made up as a fictitious character. I actually believe myself from my research that I can find where Christ actually traveled all over the globe. He was in modern day Afghanistan, Iraq, across the Himalayas, was in Tibet for a while. As a child, he'd been all over the Mediterranean with his father. He traveled to Spain, Portugal, up into Greece. He traveled a lot. And I think his crucifixion was actual, but it was a near-death experience, and his people rolled away the stone, and he escaped Israel. That's a new one for you, but I've got a video about that as well. So please look at this article. It will open your mind, and my study for decades, it's been coming together here in the last few years, has led me to like this article. It really puts everything into a condensed form that you can understand. You may be offended, you might not like it, and you may be trying to figure it out. But please give it a look. I'm not saying it's 100% correct either. Thank you for coming to the Plain Mundane Show. Please hit like and subscribe, ring the bell. I'm Alex Aquarius.